Okay, in this chapter, we're really going to talk about the hardships of this war, how it's going to take its effect on the men, and also the impact on the North as well as the South. Okay, as we've talked about, the soldiers in both the North and the South, they're relatively young. Most of them are under 21 years of age. Some of them are even younger than 16. Okay, so most of them are under 21. As the death toll rose, the South is always having trouble kind of filling its ranks. So the South starts to draft boys as young as 17 and men as old as 50. Now, I got to tell you the truth, though, guys. There's kids in there that are 12, 13 years old, and men that are probably much older than that either. The South is really getting desperate for men, all right? And what's really added to this is technology. Technology is really adding to the horrors of this war. With improved rifles, the new mini ball, cannon shells, mortars, repeating rifles. They're still using an old, battle plans against new technology, and technology is destroying the armies. In most battles, a quarter or more of the soldiers are killed or wounded. So every time you go into battle, 25% of your troops are going to be killed or wounded, which means in 4 battles, your whole unit's wiped out. All right? And medical care is extremely crude. Surgeons routinely just amputate arms or legs. And part of the reason for this is that new mini ball. The mini ball is about 1 inch long. It's about 3/4 of an inch in diameter. It's traveling at a relatively slow speed, so it's kind of this slow-moving chunk of lead flying at you. Slow is relative, of course. Today's modern rifles are shooting nearly 3,000 feet per second. These are moving about 800 feet per second. But as these lead balls are smashing into arms and legs, they are absolutely crushing the bone, just shattering the bone, or blowing out whole sections of bone. All right? So it's not like these surgeons don't want to try to, save an arm or leg. They just literally can't, because of these bullets are destroying bone. So what do? They just cut it off. Cut off your arm, cut off your leg. Okay? Sanitation is extremely poor or crude. Men are operated often in open fields or under tents in people's homes. They don't have time to sanitize or cleanse it. They really don't know much about germs and infections. And many of these people are going to die from infection, gangrene, resulting from the surgeons. All right? And, of course, disease. Disease, believe it or not, is the #1 killer. Disease, pneumonia, malaria, and dysentery killed more men than the guns or the cannons did. All right? So this is a terrible condition. These men are living under the stars. They are getting, they're soaking wet oftentimes. They're not warm. There's not enough food. They're being marched all over the place. So the longer in this war, probably their resistance to disease becomes less, and it's really going to take a toll on these guys. So what happens, remember that euphoria at the beginning of, the North are going to crush the South, and this is going to be great, and everything's going to be wonderful, and war is glorious. Well, that begins to change, right? And some people in the North begin to oppose, using force to keep the South in the Union. They're saying, let them go. What are we doing here? Why are so many people dying? Why are so many of our sons and relatives and friends dying to keep these states, and they don't want to be here anyways? So they begin to campaign against the war. Now the people who support the war call these people, the people that oppose the war, Copperheads. Copperheads. All right. So even in the North, we start to see a shortage of volunteers in the Army. They have plenty of population. It's just they don't have enough volunteers. So they start offering money to enlist. Money. If you come in the Army, we'll give you $300. Well, there starts to be all kinds of abuses. People are taking the $300 and then they're deserting, and then they're going to another town and enlisting, getting their $300 and then deserting. So you see a lot of problems with this. So finally, the government says, forget this. We're not going to, pay volunteers to enlist. So they pass a draft law. A draft law for ages 20 to 45. Men in the ages of 20 to 45 years old are now in this system where they might be forced to serve in the military. What's really bad about this draft law is, it's put into place right after the Emancipation Proclamation. So a lot of people in the North see this as a government's attempt to force men to go fight to end slavery. And a lot of these people are immigrants who are like, I didn't come to America to be forced into the military to go fight to abolish slavery. And again, these people are immigrants, usually working in low-paying jobs, often in factories, and they feel also threatened by free African Americans who might take their job, right? So they begin to riot, and there's all kinds of riots, especially in New York. It's really bad for quite some time. This riot lasts for like 4 days. They kill several people. They even kill rich people because, by the way, I should have told you this, that rich people could get out of this draft if they paid someone to take their place, all right? And many rich people did that. So they say, it's not fair that, a rich man doesn't have to go off to war. If he's got enough money, he can get out of it. That seems unfair. So, nonetheless, President Lincoln is horrified. He takes steps necessary to kind of stop these riots. What in other practices he calls disloyal practices. Lincoln even suspends the writ of habeas corpus, or the right to be charged or have a hearing before you put in jail. So if they catch you rioting, they would just throw you in jail, not even having charges set against you. All right? And the president also goes on to say that those arrested could be tried under stricter military law rather than in a civilian court or civil court. You're going to be tried at a court-martial or in a military court where the punishment is much harsher. All right? So that's a lot of problems with the North. But the South has problems as well. Now, many people still firmly believe in states' rights. Oh my gosh, states' rights, all right? Which is going to cause a problem because the federal government of the Confederacy is going to have problems. They can't, raise enough taxes. So these states, quit paying taxes. Southern governments could not collect enough to pay for the war because of states' rights. The federal government of the Confederacy is always going to be hamstrung because of that states' rights. This should be a sign to anybody who really studies history that there does need to be a central government in charge of certain things, all right? All right, so the South's in trouble. They can't raise enough money. And like the North, the South begins to not have as many volunteers. So they pass a draft law. In fact, as a matter of fact, the South was the first to pass the draft law, by the way. Okay. Near the end of the war, even with the draft, South could no longer provide enough men to fight this war. Remember, their population's already much smaller than the North anyways, plus then all the men that have died in battle or of disease. The South is going to have a real tough time. So, believe it or not, the Confederate Congress reluctantly agrees to let enslaved African Americans serve. Now, I'm not sure how that would have worked, honestly. To take your slaves, hand them weapons, and say, hey, go fight for the Confederacy. And by the way, if we win, we're going to keep the institution of slavery. But we never find out how that's going to work because the war ends before this can actually take place. But the Confederate government actually did allow for African Americans, enslaved African Americans, to fight for the Confederacy. But again, war's going to end before that actually takes place. Okay, so let's look at how the war affected the Southern economy. Well, again, we've talked about how the South is having a difficult time raising the money. So the South imposes an income tax, or a tax in kind, and this requires farmers to turn over 10% of their crops to the government. Wow, 10% of the crops. Now, the reason they, taking crops is because, the South doesn't have a lot of money. This war is going to destroy the Southern economy. They can't get, the Union Army has blockaded the ports. They can't sell their cotton. Lots of problems. The South printed so much paper money that it just led to wild inflation. In fact, by 1865, a Confederate dollar is worth 2 cents of gold. All right. And remember, the more money you print, the less it's worth. So in Richmond, the capital, in 1864, a barrel of flour cost $275. All right. Potatoes are $25 a bushel, and butter was $15 a pound. I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous. Remember, most people only made maybe $500-600 a year. So this is crazy. That loss of the cotton trade. Now, President Davis actually stopped cotton trade with Britain. Now, honestly, he'd had a tough time getting this out anyways because of the Union blockade. But what he does is he says, we are no longer going to sell cotton to Great Britain for their textile mills. And what he hopes to do is that Britain will say, oh my gosh, we really need this cotton. We will help you. They're trying to trick Britain to come into their side. But what happens is Britain finds another source of their cotton. They look to the east. They look to Egypt and to India to get their cotton. And now the South is all alone. Britain doesn't need their cotton anymore. They can get it from other sources. All right? And remember that Union blockade, it is going to create severe shortages of goods. Now the South does start to begin to build it and run its own factories, but it's too little too late. They also have severe food shortages, and many plantations switch over finally from growing cotton to raising grain and livestock to feed their people and themselves. All right? So this war has crushed the Southern economy. Well, like the North, or like the South, the North's going to have some issues too, but there's also going to be some benefits in the North. All right, so let's talk about this. To pay for the war, Congress established the nation's very first income tax, all right, and they formed the Internal Revenue Bureau, today known as the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. Also, like the South, the Union is going to have some inflation. The Union issues millions of dollars worth of bonds, which are just kind of promissory notes. They also printed more than $400 million in paper money. And just like the South, the more paper money you print, the less it's worth, all right? So this, creates high inflation, which you remember is high prices and decrease in value of the currency. So what used to cost you $1 might cost you $5 now, all right? But this war is going to be good for increased farm production. As the farmers are being forced to go into war, maybe they're being drafted, they're volunteering to fight, the technology. How can we still produce what we need without the manpower? Well, they look to technology, all right? So the demand for farm machinery to plant and harvest crops go up, all right? Which helps increase industrial profits also. And remember, these soldiers in the Army needs lots of things. They need clothes, they need shoes, guns, artillery, tents, bayonets, everything the Army needs, all right? So some manufacturers are going to make a lot of money. In fact, some are accused of profiteering, which is charging excess amount for these goods, basically taking advantage of the situation to make a profit, which is illegal, by the way. So in the North, there are some problems, but there are also some economic benefits of this war as well. Finally, we're going to talk about the women. All right, so many men had gone off to war that we need women to step forward to take some of these roles in industry and on the farms, all right? So you start to see women taking more non-traditional roles, actually working in factories, actually plowing fields, doing things. And this is going to give women a sense of accomplishment that, hey, we could do this just as well as men, all right? You also have the women's aid societies, which help supply troops with food, bedding, clothing, and especially medicine. I'm telling you, if it hadn't been for some of these women's aid societies, casualties would have been much, much worse. They also hold lots of fundraisers, bake sales, things like that to raise money for the war. They send care packages off to these soldiers, and they do quite a number of things that are really going to benefit the soldier of the war. But by far, the most important thing they do are going to be nurses. Two of the most important are Dorothea Dix. Remember her? She's the woman that we talked about in the past that was part of the prison reform and mental reform movement. But the most famous of all is going to be Clara Barton. Clara Barton. She's going to start the American Red Cross. She becomes a nurse for the Union Army. Sojourner Truth, who was an abolitionist and also a women's rights person, worked in Union hospitals. And for the South, they had Sally Tompkins set up a Confederate hospital. In fact, her hospital had the best survival rate of all hospitals, North or South. So there you have it. You see a lot of issues. This war is dragging on, a lot of tragedy for the soldiers. You start to see some resentment in the North. The people who do not support the war, these are called Copperheads. The Union needs to get more men, so they start a draft. This leads to riots. Lincoln has to suspend the writs of habeas corpus. In the South, again, same problems. They don't have enough men. They have a draft as well. They can't raise enough money, so they have an income tax. 1/10 of the crops has to go to the government. In the northern economy, you see inflation as well, but you also see some benefit. Higher farm production or machinery production, as well as industrial profits go up. And finally, women in the war, they play a tremendous role in lessening the suffering for the men in the battles. And without them, like I said before, casualties would have been much, much higher.